Hey everybody, we just would like to let you know we're officially now on iTunes, we're also on SoundCloud, and we're also on YouTube. You can look us up at Palm Beach County Young Dems or PBCYD. If you could leave us a rating or a review or comments about our interviews, it is greatly appreciated. The United States and Russia have a long and complex history from World War II allies to Cold War adversaries. Michael McFaul is a former United States ambassador to Russia who served under President Barack Obama. Previous to his service as the top diplomat to Russia, he spent many years studying the culture and politics of the former Soviet Union and Russia. I recently spoke with Michael about his latest book, From a Cold War to a Hot Peace, and to get his thoughts on the current policies the Trump administration is putting out. How did growing up in Montana and being involved in speech and debate in high school prepare you for a career in foreign policy and public service?
Well, it was the spark in my junior year of my high school at Bozeman Senior High in Montana. That's when I first started to think about the U.S.-Soviet relations. You know, I joined the debate team. I had moved from Butte, Montana, my junior year, and I'm sure for you, Butte and Bozeman are just B-towns from Montana. But moving to Bozeman, they had a more active debate team, and I was looking for an easy A in English, and so I joined up and took the debate class because I was told that was an easy A. So it was complete serendipity that I ended up joining the team. My junior year, the debate topic was improving U.S. trade policy, and so my partner and I ran a case about how to increase trade to the Soviet Union, and it was from running that case, as they're called in debate, that I first started thinking about U.S.-Soviet relations, and then came to Stanford a couple years later. By the way, my debate partner, his name is Steve Daines. He's now Senator Steve Daines, and he just voted recently on the right way, in my view. Even though he's a Republican, he joined with 11 other Republicans with a group of Democrats to vote to sustain sanctions against some Russian companies. So I'm hoping that, part of our interaction together 35 years ago or whatever, has helped him to think the right way about Russia.
So the NATO bombings campaigns against Milosevic and Serbia further strained U.S.-Russia relations in the late 1990s. While you acknowledge that President Yeltsin, the Russian government, and Russian society rejected NATO's explanation for the bombing campaign, you also noted that the news of the genocide occurred in Kosovo never reached most Russians. In your opinion, was there any way that NATO-affiliated countries could have committed to educating and informing Russian society more about what was occurring in Serbia that would have changed the outcome at all?
That's a great question. I haven't thought about it systematically. I do think that, generally speaking, we do not do a very good job of explaining our policies, and I mean this when I say we, the United States of America, and most certainly during that period, I was not in the government at the time, but I was traveling back and forth to Moscow and watching those events. I do think we should have tried harder. Of course, the problem is today in Russia that, unlike back then, by the way, it would have been different back then, but today most of the major media outlets are controlled by the Russian government, so it's harder to do, and I experienced that when I was ambassador. But the more we can do to just state the facts and explain our side of the facts, I think it's better, because the worst thing you can have is a confrontation with any country, but especially Russia, that's based on misunderstanding or bad information.
How different do you think Russia and U.S.-Russia relations would be today if Yeltsin had chosen Nepsov as his successor over Putin?
I believe it'd be radically different, and I think I'm glad you asked that question, because I think there's a tendency in America, in academia, in the government, to treat states, countries in the world with fixed national interest, and I just don't believe that's true. I think they change depending on what system of government is there and who are the leaders. I mean, think about our country right today. To assume that there's something called American national interests and American behavior in the world, and to pretend that there's no difference between President Trump and President Obama, I think most Americans would say that's absurd. Both Republicans and Democrats, by the way, would say that's absurd. So why do we treat it that way when we think about other countries as if they're unitary actors with fixed national interests? And the particular case of Boris Nemtsov, I knew him well. He was a friend of mine. He was a charismatic, pro-Western, democratically minded leader who had successfully won elections before, and the plan was for Boris Yeltsin to anoint him as his successor. This is a plan they put together in 1997, and that's when Nemtsov moved to Moscow and became the first deputy prime minister. And then tragically and unexpectedly, there was the August 1998 financial crisis in Russia. It was actually a worldwide crisis, but it affected Russia in particular. And as a result of that, Nemtsov had to step down. And that's when Putin became prime minister. And I think had that financial crisis not occurred in 98, let's say it occurred, 2 years later, Nemtsov would have been the president. And I think the course of both Russia's internal politics would have been more democratic, more market-oriented, and most certainly relations between Russia and the West would have been closer.
In your recent book, you noted that early on in Putin's presidency, early 2000s, the Clinton administration did little to push back against Putin and his democratic erosion that he was enacting. Why do you think that is?
Yep. Well, partly because Putin was less clear in his preferences back then than he is today, although not for me, but I wrote my first piece warning about Putin's autocratic ways in the Washington Post in March 2000, even before he was president. So, but I take the point that it was more ambiguous, especially with respect to markets and relations with the West. Number two, the Clinton administration was in the last months of their term, right? And it's difficult to have new initiatives in your 8th year compared to your first. And then number three, I think there was some rethinking about Putin and his relationship with us in the early Bush years. But then September 11th happened, 2001, and that created a moment where Putin and Bush decided that our two countries could be allies in the fight against terrorism. And so as a result of September 11th, we didn't focus as much on what was happening internally in Russia.
So you just mentioned how you had noticed this early on, and you had actually wrote an op-ed, if I'm understanding you, warning about Putin's autocratic tendencies. So you were not only becoming pessimistic about the state of Russia with Putin's rise as president, but the Bush administration's lack of attention to the ongoing problems in Russia. Again, as you noted, because of 9/11 and the hopes that Russia would become a U.S. ally in the war against terrorism. So in your opinion, how could the Bush administration have better engaged with Russia and ongoing internal problems in Russia while also promoting their freedom agenda?
Well, I think there was a real paradox in the Bush freedom agenda, in that it focused on countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, but did not focus on countries like Russia. And as Russia became more autocratic during the Bush years, they were focused on other parts of the world. Now, I would also say we should never overestimate the power of the United States to pressure countries to become more democratic. And, I've written another book about that, by the way, and I talk about those limits. And the larger the country, the harder it is to do. So I don't want to say it would have been easy, but I don't even think they were trying in those first years.
After Putin served 2 terms, he announced that he was not going to seek a 3rd term and endorsed Dmitry for president in 2008. Many in Moscow and Washington assumed Putin's defense minister, Sergei Ivanov, would have been Putin's choice as a successor. Do you think Russia would be any different today if Sergei had become president?
It's a good counterfactual. I don't know. One thing to speculate is whether Putin would have come back or not, because Sergei Ivanov was a much more powerful figure back then at the time, and I don't think would have been so cooperative or acquiescent to Putin coming back as president. I think what we saw with Medvedev was somebody who was moderately more pro-Western, pro-democratic, pro-market, and he did certain things for that 4 years to move in those directions, and most certainly he did in terms of cooperation with the United States, but then Putin rolled it all back. So the potential for change in a more democratic and pro-Western trajectory was greater with Medvedev compared to Ivanov. But once Putin came back, he interrupted that potential. So you might have been in the same place you were, irrespective of which one had been president for those 4 years.
In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, and the Bush administration did very little to push back on that, or even punish Russia. Why do you think that was?
I don't know for sure. Again, it's not unlike the question you asked me about the Clinton administration with early Putin years. It was August 2008, the elections were coming. They had fought two wars, very controversial wars. I just don't think they had it in them to take a big confrontational push with Russia at the time. But it's a great question. I don't actually know the answer to that. I think other historians will have to dig into that more closely.
So in your book, you mentioned your first briefing on Russia's invasion of Georgia with then President Obama on his 2008 campaign. You mentioned in your book that Obama rejected both major schools of thought in international relations, realism and liberalism, stating that in the real world you have to be part realist and part liberal, depending on the circumstances. Do you agree with that?
Yes, with some nuance. So I believe we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I don't believe that you have to choose either or most times. Number two, and this would be, my argument with realists in general, they assume that somehow promoting our values is not in the American national interest. It's just some kind of thing we do to be nice. And I don't believe that. I think that the spread of democracy around the world has been very beneficial to American national security and to American economic interests. If you think about every war we fought, every war we fought, with one or two possible exceptions, have been with autocrats and dictatorships. And those are costly wars. So the fewer dictatorships we have in the world, the better it is for our security. Second, the transformation of autocracies into democracies has often led to those countries becoming our allies. So you think about most obviously Japan, Germany, Italy, all those countries are now close American allies. When they were run by dictators, they were our enemies. And even in Eastern Europe, which has gotten a lot of attention these days about, well, what does NATO do for us or not? But we have all kinds of new allies as a result of the transitions from communism to democracy in that part of the world. And they help us in terms of advancing our security. Number one, by just avoiding war, right? People forget that wars are costly for us, and we get dragged into them when they happen in Europe. But number two, they fight with us in our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, for instance, and are part of a coalition as opposed to us going alone. So that would be my argument, my pushback on Obama and others about why we shouldn't think of promoting our values as just some kind of charity thing we do, but it actually can help our concrete security and economic interests.
You obviously mentioned President Obama, and we've just been recently talking about him. You worked in Obama's administration for roughly about 5 years. You first came on as a foreign advisor on the Russian reset, and then later on you became the U.S. Russian ambassador. What was one of your favorite memories of working in the Obama administration?
Well, first off, it was just an honor and privilege of a lifetime. I loved it, both the White House job and the job in Moscow. Just, number one, the privilege to work with him. He's an extremely talented individual, thoughtful, intellectual, smart, deliberative, and with me, as I got to know him, friendly, supportive guy. So that's, what more could you want in a boss, even if sometimes I disagreed with our policies. It was a great honor to be part of his team, and I'm very proud of my service working for him. Second, privilege to work for the United States of America was a thrill of a lifetime. I love that, especially working in Moscow, by the way, where, I was a representative of the United States of America in Russia. I loved driving around with the American flag on my car. I loved showing up and speaking on behalf of the American people at various cultural events. So serving Obama and serving our country in big, at 30,000 feet, that was just great. And I hope I get a chance to do it again another time in the future. But if I don't, I'm really grateful for those 5 years. In terms of some memories that really stand out, so on the policy side, there are some big events. So, I worked on the New START Treaty between Russia and the United States, which reduced our nuclear arsenals by 30%. And I think the capstone events for getting that treaty done were some of the great individual moments or days of my service. So one was the signing of that treaty in Prague, and we all flew to Prague with the president, and we had this fantastic ceremony, ceremony in the castle there, and they signed the treaty. But then the coda to that was the day that the Senate ratified the treaty. It's hard to get 67 senators to do anything together these days, as you know. And that day, it was the last day that the Senate was in session of 2010. I rode in the motorcade down with Vice President Biden so that he could preside over that vote, and we watched the vote go down, and we got 72 votes, and that was fantastic. And then later that day, out of the blue, the president invited us to come drink champagne in the Oval Office right before he flew to Hawaii for his holiday vacation, and no, that was a great event in terms of policy. I would like to add one more from my time in Moscow, which is there was a concert, and I won't remember the group now, but it was an African-American choir from a school, I want to say Alabama, but I'm not sure, but it was a gospel choir that came to Moscow. And, one of the fantastic events, parts of your job as ambassador is participating and celebrating and bringing, representatives of American culture and business and sports to Russia, right? It was a fantastic job. I hosted the NBA at my house, for instance, right? A bunch of NBA All-Stars. They haven't come to my house in Palo Alto. I hosted Herbie Hancock, who was my child. I was a trumpet player, a jazz trumpet player. He was my idol as a kid. And 500 of my closest friends in Moscow, came to my house to listen to him perform. But there was this one performance where it was it was at a public place, so there's a couple thousand people there, and they started singing Amazing Grace in English, and Russians just spontaneously stood up and started singing along, but in Russian. And it was just so powerful because it was this demonstration about how, yes, we're going to have our policy differences, but at the people-to-people level, we have a lot in common. And people were in tears. It was just this very emotional moment of connection between Americans and Russians, not through our language and not through our governments, but through the music that Americans were creating that day in Moscow.
We're talking about policy here, because you've mentioned that you had some policy differences with then President Obama regarding Russia. What would be one policy difference that you differentiated with him on respectfully?
Well, I think the biggest one was probably Syria. And in fact, Syria is the longest chapter in my book because it's such a tortured chapter for me of some missed opportunities we had. And, in particular, when there was a moment way before the red line thing, I'll get to that in a minute, but earlier on, I think we just should have pushed it more aggressively to have a multilateral pressure for a negotiated transition there. Now, it's easy to say, and President Obama, if he were on the call here, he would say that was impossible, but I think we should have pushed a lot harder early on. And the reason we didn't is we thought Assad was going to fall, and so we didn't want to get involved. Why muck it up when the Syrians were doing just well without us? But we tragically know now that it wasn't the case, and that Syria, he had more resilience. And then the second one, the famous red line where President Obama said that we would attack Syria if they use chemical weapons. They use chemical weapons, and we, at the end of the day, decided not to use force. I think that was a mistake. That probably was the one biggest set of policy issues where my own views were at odds with where where President Obama and our administration came down.
What do you feel that we as Americans can learn from Putin's approach to Russia's old oligopoly and how he condensed financial strength affected global politics and the global economy? What do you think we can learn from that here in our own country?
Well, we can learn that the rule of law matters, and that if you allow it to slip, it creates relationships between the government and the private sector that do not benefit the people. I think Russia today is a great instance of lost opportunity. Russia could be so much richer today than it is, and it's because of that relationship between Putin and the oligarchs that have stunted growth and have stunted opportunity and small business opportunity and high-tech opportunity. And, we have instances of that, most certainly in our country, and we should make sure to, militantly defend the rule of law, especially when it comes to kind of corrupt practices between the government and the private sector.
So, obviously this is all really focused on Russia. How do you feel about the U.S.'s relationship with Russia currently? Do you feel that, in the future that things could get better, or are you pessimistic about that?
Well, I'm not optimistic in the short run, and by the short run I mean the rest of the time that Putin is in power. I just don't see him changing his views of us, and I think we're naive to think that you could do that by having, these secret meetings that President Trump has had with him. And so the second thing I would say is that I generally think the Trump administration has the right policy towards Russia, and I think there's a lot of continuity of that policy the Obama administration. And they don't like it when I say that, but after Putin annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine, the Obama administration did three important things. Number one, they strengthened NATO. Number two, they sanctioned Russian individuals and companies involved in those operations. And number three, they provided military and economic and political support to Ukraine. I think that's the right strategy. And the Trump administration, by and large, has done most of that as well. And in a few instances, they've even gone farther than the Obama administration, for instance, providing lethal assistance to Ukraine. The problem with their strategy is that their President Trump doesn't agree with it. He's constantly undermining it. He's constantly saying things that are at odds with the general approach of the administration. So, I said it's the right thing to do to enhance NATO, and if you look at the policy, that's been true. But President Trump rhetorically has lambasted NATO, and I think, now we know from New York Times reporting is even talking about pulling out of NATO. I think that's very bad for the alliance. With sanctions, he signed the new law, but he did it with regret. He doesn't think it's the right thing to do, and the Trump administration just lifted sanctions on the group of companies owned by Oleg Deripaska for no reason that I can understand. I literally cannot understand why they did it. And then third, with respect to Ukraine, the policy I think is basically right, but President Trump doesn't seem very enthusiastic about that policy. He never says anything in terms of support for Ukrainian democracy or sovereignty. His response to the Russian capturing of these 24 Ukrainian sailors, he's been very equivocal in his statements about that. And then finally, Trump praises Putin. He's constantly seeking favor from President Putin, constantly repeating talking points of Vladimir Putin, including ones about me, by the way, when they met in Helsinki, and Putin spun this cockamamie story that a dozen U.S. government officials had helped to launder money out of Russia to help the Hillary Clinton campaign, and therefore he wanted to interrogate us. And this story is completely fabricated. It's 100% untrue. And yet President Trump said, well, I think that's a good idea for you to interrogate these people. And I could go on. He thinks, he often repeats things that Putin says. So that, to me, is not the right way to conduct any policy towards any country, but especially one as important as Russia.
So we're talking about NATO here, and we know that NATO was formed after the end of World War II and has greatly expanded throughout time. Now, Trump has expressed privately to his advisors, and as we've seen in the news, of pulling out NATO, and it's constantly said that America pulling out of NATO would be catastrophic for global democracy and that it would empower Russia and Putin specifically. Can you explain to me how that exactly empowers Russia?
Well, the goal of NATO is to maintain security and peace in Europe, right? That's what NATO does. And when one country is attacked, then all the other countries rally to that country's side to respond to that attack. And the only time they've done that formally has been when we were attacked. I think a lot of Americans forget that we were attacked on September 11th, and NATO came to our aid in the war in Afghanistan, not the other way around. And when soldiers from NATO countries die in defense of America, I think Americans need to appreciate that sacrifice that they've done for our security, not for their security. Number two, I'm a Democrat. I work for Barack Obama, but I also believe what Ronald Reagan said: peace through strength. If there's no threat, if you strengthen strengthen NATO, you reduce probability that any country, including Russia, will attack one of the NATO allies. So that's preventive measures, right? That's preventative policy so that we're not, God forbid, in some kind of military conflict with Russia. And number three, democracy has thrived within the NATO alliance. It wasn't always that way, but it's moved in that way. And I think it's in America's interest to have democratic allies. One, as I said,